Welcome to Charm of the Wilderness, where we embark on a journey through the stunning landscapes of our national parks and public lands, expanding our understanding of climate justice and Indigenous justice along the way. I'm Elizabeth Dorr, your guide in exploring the rich tapestry of our national parks and public lands, discovering not only their breathtaking beauty, but also the vital lessons they hold for our planet's future, as well as the challenging history and current political context of these parks and public lands. Join me as I talk to inspiring, innovative, and driven people working in environmental justice, climate science, Indigenous education, equity in the outdoors, and more to delve into pressing environmental issues and learn how we can advocate for a more equitable and sustainable world for all. Probably already heard her. And Mike is an enrolled member of the Spirit Lake Dakota Nation and a Turtle Mountain Chippewa descendant. Mike is currently working at the Montana Office of Public Instruction as an Indian education specialist. Mike has been working with Indian education issues for the past 34 years and has teaching experience at both the K through 12 and university levels. He has a BS in history education, a master's in school administration, and an education specialist degree. Mike works to provide educators with knowledge, skills, and resources so that they can effectively implement Indian Education for All, or IEFA, into their schools and classrooms. I'm really excited to talk to Mike about IEFA because it is one of the most unique programs in the country, and it's going to be really cool to hear more about it. But Mike, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here.
Well, Hamitaki Api. Hello, my relatives out there. Uha Chante Waste Not Petchuzat Pado. I greet all of you at the Heartfelt Handshake via the virtual airwaves here, and just honored to be a part of the program. So nice to meet you here. And I gave you a traditional Dakota greeting. I said, Hamitaki Api. And that means hello, my relatives. And when I was younger, my dad always told me to greet people as relatives. And I asked him why. And he said, well, that way you can hit them up for cash later on. So it's an old Indian trick. So.
I love it. I love it. And we have a whole audience of people who we can hit up for cash.
All right.
Well, this is great to have you here. So let's actually start, before we get into Indian Education for All, tell me a little bit about yourself and how you came to do what you do now.
Sure. Well, I actually grew up in South Dakota. And that's where I started my teaching career on the Cheyenne River Reservation. And I used to teach at a place called Takini School. And I taught history and government and tribal government and Lakota studies, junior high social studies. And that experience really immersed me in culture and language and ceremony, being in that community, and really opened my, knowledge base and eyes and heart and mind, just traditional worldviews, perspectives. And so I carry that into my work. I actually came to Montana to pursue a master's degree in school administration at Montana State University. And then I never left the state. I got a job working here, and I worked in several different positions. Currently work at the Office of Public Instruction, but I also taught for 3 years at Montana State University. I used to teach the multicultural education courses in their pre-service program. So yeah, it's fun work that I do, and it's an honor to be a part of this work too. So
that's amazing. Well, and Montana is such an incredible state. We were talking beforehand, and I lived there briefly right after college in Missoula, and it's always held a special place in my heart, and I had intentions of going back, and it just never happened. But I do visit quite a bit. So can you give me a little bit of background on Indian Education for All in Montana? What is it? How did it originate? And how has it evolved over the years?
Sure. Well, Montana is unique. We are the only state that has it written into our state constitution, and we'll teach about American Indians. And that was put into our constitution back in 1972. And it says the state recognizes the distinct and unique cultural heritage of American Indians and is committed in its educational goals to the preservation of their cultural integrity. And that is language straight out of the Montana Constitution. Wow. And when that happened, there was all kinds of efforts put into place, people, trying to bring teachers together to figure out what this means, the Board of Public Education, university systems, and they actually developed a plan for Indian education in Montana back in 1975. And it's interesting to have read those plans because we're still working on some of those things people talked about back
Yeah.
then, 40 years ago. And so, but it's really neat to see how this work has progressed. Back in 1997, there was legislation passed to designate a day in Montana for Indigenous, American Indian Heritage Day, and that still exists. But then in 1999, there was legislation passed, which is now known as Indian Education for All, and that was, initiated to say, well, we're really not fulfilling our constitutional obligation as much as we should be. And so legislation was passed to reinforce that and say, well, let's really make sure this happens at a systemic statewide level. And so since that happened, there's been all kinds of efforts, bringing tribal representatives together, tribal knowledge keepers, teachers to really say, well, what does this mean for our state? What does this mean in our classrooms, across Montana, K through 12, and then also higher ed. And in 2004, there was a school funding lawsuit against the state saying we weren't funding schools to the level that we should be. And so there was an amicus brief that the Montana Indian Education filed with that lawsuit saying, well, the state's never funded Indian education for all. And as a result of that lawsuit in 2005, the state got money and schools got money to implement Indian education for all in their classrooms. So previous to that was an unfunded mandate. But since now we have funding and we actually put it into our definition of a quality education.
Oh, cool.
If you're providing a quality education, it should be incorporating American Indian cultures and histories into your classroom, because that's what that lawsuit said. It said you must define a quality education and then fund that definition. And so when Indian Ed for All got rolled into that, that's when things really started happening even more, where we could bring people together, write lesson plans, pay cultural consultants to do work on our behalf, do professional development for teachers, So it's been a really cool work in progress, and we still continue to to work on this initiative. It's ongoing.
Yeah.
So
That's amazing. I mean, I'm jealous. I mean, students in Montana are so lucky to have that integrated into the education system. I mean, that's something that I grew up in Spokane, as we talked about, and the Spokane Indian tribe was adjacent to the city, but there was no education, no connection to the tribe or the reservation, and also in northern Idaho too, is the other tribes in the region, and it took me 40 years of my life almost to really get to a point to understand that we all live on indigenous land and to learn about the different tribes in the regions that I live and work and play and visit. And I think that it's so cool that students in Montana all students get to have that education growing up in a deeper context of the place that we are from. So.
Yeah, and one of the things I guess that provides a really cool contextual aspect to our educational programming is right after Indian Education for All was passed in 1999. I was actually lucky to be here at OPI at that time, working along with Denise Juneau, and we worked together to bring representatives from every tribal nation. And we said, what would you want every kid in every school to learn about you? And out of those discussions grew a document called the Essential Understandings Regarding Montana Indians. And there are 7 of them, but you can basically break those essential understandings down into 4 concepts of diversity, culture, history, and sovereignty. And, we try and weave those themes into our curriculum resources and connect those to state standards. But then you're reinforcing one of those essential understandings. And so we talk about tribal diversity, individual American Indian diversity amongst tribal members themselves, history, there are historical connections that are tens and 20 and thousands of years old, from our indigenous populations here in the Americas. And it's really cool to be a part of that, sharing that, rich history. But then, the culture aspect, there are songs, ceremonies that are tens of
Mm.
thousands of years old that are still being, maintained by, native peoples across the country. And it's really cool to see that work and connecting with knowledge keepers and what information would you like us to share with kids. And, there's things that we don't share that are private and kept in, more of that
Hmm.
ceremonial aspect. But, what public knowledge would you want out there and to share that? And then sovereignty. Sovereignty is what makes Indian people unique from any other cultural group,
Hmm.
is that as members of federally recognized tribes, we have a unique legal and political relationship with the federal government. And that's really, a cool, unique thing that exists in our country and in our state. And so, like the state of Montana, symbolically honors the eight sovereign nations that live here within our state. And we actually have a tribal nations flag monument at our state
Oh,
capitol
cool.
where the flags of the eight sovereign nations fly at the same level as the U.S. flag and the Montana flag. And so every Montanan that goes into our Capitol building, legislators, lobbyists, they're all, it's a really cool symbolic acknowledgement of, the tribes that are here. It's powerful.
Yeah.
And so, that's just another one of these things that has happened, but it would probably not have happened without our
Hmm.
constitutional and legal obligation to make this, a reality. But then, you're in Washington. Washington has their own Indian education for all effort, since time immemorial. Oregon, Nevada, California, South Dakota, North Dakota, Maine. This is happening, across the country in
Hmm.
different states. And what's really cool for me is a lot of these states have developed essential understandings for their tribes based on our model here in Montana.
That's cool.
And even the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., spent time here in Montana with us. And they went back to the Smithsonian. They created a set of essential understandings for the nation based on our
Oh, that's
Montana model,
so
which
cool.
is very cool. And so that's why I always tell educators, you're making history. This is a historic endeavor, and it's still
Yeah.
ongoing. We've still got a lot of work to do, but I've seen some really neat things happen in our classroom. And I'm sorry if I
No,
ramble
no,
on
this
here.
was great. I mean,
I just joined a support group for people who talk too much. Yeah, you know what it's called,
what is
Elizabeth?
it called?
It's called On and On, Anon.
Maybe I should join that because I do.
Yes.
Yes, but that was no, that was perfect. Well, can you tell me a little bit about what your role at IEFA is?
Sure. Well, right now I just work on, curriculum and professional development and then also maintain our website. And so, help develop lesson plans and curriculum resources in collaboration with Montana teachers. And then we also go out to schools and, provide on-site workshops. And then we also do online webinars. And we're having a big best practices conference coming up here in March. And where we bring classroom teachers to share what's working in their classrooms, to share with other teachers. So it's not just us here at OPI
Hmm.
telling people what to do, but they're hearing from teachers and, what's happening in the classroom and, what's working. And so we try and share those, best practices. And so that's, a fun part of my job is to get to meet with teachers and hear what they're doing that's really having an impact in the classroom and helping students expand their, their knowledge regarding, tribes here in Montana and across the U.S. too. So,
Yeah. Can you give
so
can
that's,
you give me an
oh,
example of maybe a curriculum or piece of curriculum that you really enjoyed working on or
yeah,
that you've heard really great responses from
yeah.
teachers?
You bet. Well, one of our IFA team members, her name is Carrie McNabb. She lives up on the Rocky Boys Reservation, but she is a champion powwow dancer. It spends, the season, just traveling to powwows, her whole family powwows. And that's one of our resources on our website is a guide to understanding and enjoying
Mm,
powwows.
cool.
And it needed updating. And so Carrie coming into our office and bringing that passion and knowledge base about powwows, we revised that guide and included more contemporary examples and videos, explaining what the different dances are and, putting in pictures of Montana tribal members that dance those different categories and then connecting it to our state standards. And so that was a really fun publication to work on because, a lot of people are aware of powwows and,
Yeah.
what are those all about and what songs are they singing and what are they saying? And so We even have interviews with, tribal singers sharing the structure of the songs and what the songs mean. And so that's part of that guide too.
That is so
And
cool.
so that was really cool.
One can take advantage of that. Like, it's not, that's so cool, is that it's public information that adults and students alike can utilize.
Yeah, and that's a good place to start too. It's like it's a cool event, it's a celebration, and then later on, if you want to dive into some of those other topics too in a classroom, and depending on what your content area or grade level is, you can do that. Like we have some tribal singers, I call them, indigenous song keepers. Interviews with folks who are walking encyclopedias of songs regarding, ceremony or powwow. We have songs for everything. And so some of these individuals, were, felt that it was important to share what they know. And so I was able to capture them on video, and they're dropping some really cool nuggets of cultural information regarding music and singing. But then we had some teachers here at East Helena in the schools, and then they worked to create discussion questions with their students around those videos
Cool.
to even enhance them more. And so we have this base of knowledge that we put out there, but then teachers are taking that and then figuring out ways to, make it relevant and meaningful for their, curriculum, and then connecting it back to those standards that we have to teach anyway. And so those are the fun kind of projects that I get to be a part of. And then we're always, developing more resources. So
that is so cool. What have you seen over the years regarding general knowledge of Indigenous peoples among Montana citizens because of IFA? IFA, is that what you call the office, IFA?
Yeah, we just call it IFA. That's our acronym.
And does IFA track the data on knowledge and appreciation even? And so I'd be curious to know what you've seen over the years from...
Yeah, well, we used to have several different types of reporting systems that I've seen here over the years. One was called the annual data collection, where schools submitted information, and another one was called these teams reports. But we're doing something totally different now with our accreditation with schools. They actually have to submit evidence of what they're teaching in the classrooms.
Cool.
It could be samples of student work, or they show here's professional development that our staff have gone through relating to Indian Ed for All. And so for me, that was a really cool affirmation of the work to say, hey, what are these schools across the state submitting for their evidence? And we developed the scoring rubric just like you would for a classroom assignment. And then we evaluated schools on the scale for how well they're implementing Indian Ed for All. And that was really cool to see, but it also showed we still have more work to do. And we've been trying to be more proactive and telling schools, here's some good ways to, collect your data to show what's happening and provide that evidence, and, to try not to make it too much of a burden.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I know some schools that have created like Google Forms, and they send it out once a month, and then a teacher would fill out an example of something they did with Indian Ed for All, and it just gets collected automatically. And so it's neat to see teachers utilize technology in a way to collect their classroom data, and then they submit those plans, to OPI, and then we evaluate them. And then schools also get funding for Indian Ed for All, and we provide guidance on that about how to use their money, to either provide curriculum materials or pay teachers to go to professional development, or maybe bringing in knowledge keepers or going on some field trip to a cultural site. So, we try and provide guidance on how to do that too. So.
Yeah, I was thinking about field trips. I mean, I bet there's so many amazing opportunities for field trips because there's so much tribal land in Montana that almost everywhere you go, there is some kind of nearby cultural site that students could visit. And so I bet there are some amazing opportunities. Or even, a field trip to a powwow would be really cool too. So it's so many opportunities.
Yeah, well, several years I got a call from Google Earth, and they wanted to come out and do something, and then we suggested they go to Crow Fair, and so there's like a virtual Google Earth thing of Crow Fair where you can, experience that powwow. But it was kind of cool that someone from Billings, Montana, who grew up in the schools there, worked for Google, and she, knew we had Indian Ed for All, and said, well, it'd be cool to do something here to provide like a virtual, opportunity for people to experience a powwow if they can't ever get to one.
That is a great idea.
That was kind of cool to see. But like we have, several buffalo jumps in our state. And at one of our buffalo jumps, the Madison Buffalo Jump, which is a state park, we had a tribal knowledge keeper, Dr. Shane Doyle, who's Crow. We
And I
videoed him
interviewed
there.
him. He's going to be on the
Yeah, well, you
podcast
interviewed
too.
Shane.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, Shane is on several of our videos, and so he's providing like a virtual tour of the state park, explaining the meanings behind buffalo jumps and things like drive lines and what the tribes would do and some of the significance of that area. And so we try and provide virtual guest speakers. If you can't
Yeah.
bring in a knowledge keeper to your classroom, well, here's our YouTube channel where we have hundreds of interviews with different tribal knowledge keepers and elders sharing information about their tribes. And like with that one with Shane, that's a really cool place-based video
Mm-hmm.
that we did with state parks. And I think state parks even made a little, what do you call those little things now? It's got all the dots on it.
Like a
QR code.
a what? Oh, a QR code.
A QR. Yeah, they made a QR code, so it's like at their signage, people could hear Shane's video now.
That's
there.
so
So
cool.
it's
I'll have
cool
to
see.
put the video in the show notes because yeah, I talked to Shane last week and he's incredible. He's an incredible educator too.
Yeah, and he's done work across the nation and internationally.
Yeah.
And so that's really cool that have those kind of individuals here that we get to partner up with. And he's actually going to be our keynote speaker the opening day of our best practice. He'll be coming to share some of his cool work. But it's neat for me to go out into schools and then to hear people, oh yeah, we had Dr. Doyle come in or whatever. Or when a teacher shares one of our videos.
Yeah.
And I was in Gardner, Montana 2 weeks ago, and I went into this fifth grade classroom, and one kid says, "Hey, it's the guy from the video." They just
He's
watched
famous.
a video that I had been on, and they remembered a joke I told too. It's like, "You told us the buffalo joke," and what I told those kids was, I said, "Do you know why you never see a buffalo hiding in a tree?
Why?
Because they're really, really good at it." That's good middle school humor there.
Oh my God, I love it. Actually, I meant to ask you, what is a buffalo jump?
Oh, these were sites that tribes would, drive buffalo over, like a cliff. And so they had these things called drive lines, and they might have buffalo runners, and there was ways they could, kind of herd the bison into that narrow thing, because it's an interesting phenomena that they'll follow that lead bison, and they went over that cliff, and then people would go and butcher there, and it was almost like a Costco. Everybody in the region. It's like when that happened. But then there are also the ceremonial connections to that animal, thanking it and having a deep spiritual and cultural relationship with buffalo. But then after that butchering happened, every part of that buffalo was used, and then what was left over, everybody else came. Then here comes the magpies, here come the coyotes, and anybody else that would come and take part of that offering there. So basically nothing went to waste. The tribal folks, who have, whether it be the Blackfeet or some other tribe that used that jump, would get what they would need, and then they'd move on, and the other folks would come in and clean it up. So it was a good symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
Working in connection, because like in Dakota we say mitako yasi. Mitako yasi means everything is connected and we're all related.
Mitako yasi.
And how to treat people as a relative. And in Dakota, the word for earth is unchimaka. That's our grandmother. And we're walking on our grandmother, and just trying to think about how relationships with animals, with the environment, and how we can treat everything as a relative, and just try and be a good relative.
That's beautiful. Well, you talked a little bit about the work that you have done in partnership with Montana State Parks. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Several years ago, we worked with a couple of fish, wildlife, and park folks, and we developed lesson plans for quite a few state parks, I think 25. And we just, had them develop curriculum resources that fit with Indian Ed for All and with our state standards. So say a class is going to do a field trip to Madison Buffalo Jump, they'd have a lesson plan already that's connected to social studies standards, language arts, and science for different grade levels. And then there's, learning about bison and the importance of bison and what is a buffalo jump. And so they'd have a little background knowledge built in before they actually go to the site. And so, we've engaged in that partnership, but all those curriculum materials need some updates since we worked on them. And that's part of this ongoing process too, is something's out there for a few years and you link to websites and then they go away. And so we have to recreate some things like those videos videos that Shane created, weaving those into the lesson plans about the bison jump too. So that's, some of the cool work that's still ongoing. And, that's on my to-do list is, to make sure we get some of those lesson plans updated to make them, enhance them, I guess.
Yeah.
'Cause we're always, getting better at what we do and learning more. And there's more resources being developed by other people, as this happens.
Yeah. So. The process never ends.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like the videos also are a really great example or just, utilizing technology to connect students who can't go to the parks or who aren't going to be going on the field trips to really still give them a sense of the place despite not having to or be able to go. So I think that's like that diversity of resources is really useful as well.
Yeah, and speaking of videos, you lived in Missoula and they have the Big Sky Film Fest there.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever got to go to that, but we worked with them too. And they have these documentary films that are, made by indigenous documentary filmmakers. And we try and, we choose 3 films that we have curriculum developed. The Big Sky Film Institute and their education staff put this together. Then we help collaborate on it. But then they have these films and they get beamed out to classrooms across Montana. And then the cool part of that is there's a live webinar series with the filmmakers and the subjects of those films. And so students can ask questions of the filmmakers and the people that were featured in the film. And that's what those kids from Gardner had seen me on. They'd watched a movie about bison restoration on the Blackfeet Reservation called Bring Them Home. Powerful documentary film, but it's really neat to see indigenous-made documentary films having curriculum connected to them, and kids across the state can, see that.
Yeah.
And learn from indigenous people sharing their stories the way they want them to be shared.
That's so cool. Have you worked at all with the National Park Service? Is it mostly Montana state parks?
A few different parks.
Yeah.
Little Bighorn Battlefield reached out. They're park specialists, and they're updating their visitor center, and so they want to make sure they weave in the essential understandings into some of their programming and displays there. And so that was a connection. They reached out to me, and hopefully we can, figure out ways to, partner up on that. I've talked to people at Pompey's Pillar. That's another national site here in Montana that's connected to Lewis and Clark, and they do some cool things too. And so, Yellowstone Park, Shane's done a lot of work with those guys on, having indigenous perspectives, throughout the park. I just did a curriculum, a lesson plan, just all about, landscape and connections to that, and included some stuff about Yellowstone.
That's really cool. And,
yeah, and it's just a neat story, And so those parks, millions of visitors go to them. And so, that's why it's important to make sure that indigenous perspective is there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in relevant ways. Meaningful ways.
Yeah.
Authentic ways.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of park signs and that aren't quite, they're accurate, or they might have a certain bias to them. And it's a lot of cases not intentional, just because of the cultural perspective that person was writing.
Yeah, lack of knowledge. Yeah, and not including indigenous peoples in actually writing the literature. Yeah, I mean,
or terms like discover,
or
new world. It's not to say those are wrong, but they're not inclusive if you've already been somewhere.
That's such a good point, actually, that there are a lot of words that we might think are benign because they're just part of the lexicon, and it's part of how we've been educated in this country, more or less, by, this idea of discovery, this idea of colonization as being positive things. And I think that there is kind of a national unlearning process, many who are resistant to it, as we'll get into it a little bit, but that might actually lead to some kind of good reflections when you're going to the parks and identifying some kind of problematic language in the literature or in the signs that are there, in addition to, inaccurate information about the indigenous
Yeah,
peoples.
like terminology like nation of immigrants, right?
Yeah.
We've heard that before. Well, for indigenous people, if you've been here for 20,000 years or more, you're an immigrant, and so, that's interesting stuff. But a lot of that is not intentional. It's just people writing from their cultural
Mm-hmm.
perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why it's so important to have those indigenous perspectives alongside that, like the westward movement,
Yeah.
right? Well, to the Blackfeet and, other tribes out here, the Crow, Cheyenne, it wasn't a westward movement. It was an eastern invasion,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And the way we present Lewis and Clark here is how many tribes discovered those guys coming up that river lost, right? A different way of looking at Lewis and Clark. Who discovered who? The view from the shore is just as important as those dudes coming up those canoes.
Yeah.
So,
100%.
so that's we really try and share that. But then we also say it's not about blame, shame, or guilt. It's just really having a more inclusive look.
Yeah.
Where we've been, where we're at, and hopefully where we're going together. But like what we say, it's still a work in progress, and we've got more work to do.
I think we could say the same about our country as being a work in progress.
Democracy is a work in progress.
Well, one of the things that you and I have talked about over email, and I mean is really on a lot of our minds, is the erasure of indigenous stories, also Black history from national park sites. So let's just talk about this kind of political moment and how you're feeling in it. And I mean, I think that there's something really amazing in Montana that this education is already part of the curriculum. And so by, taking these signs or whatever out of the national parks is going to have less effect on locals, but on visitors, it could. Although I tend to think that like you had kind of mentioned, is that the National Park Service, the signage and literature about indigenous peoples from the lands where the parks are currently on was kind of lacking and also inconsistent anyway. I went to Yosemite and they have really amazing literature and a lot of great indigenous education embedded into the park there and in the junior ranger program, but it's not the case in some of the other parks. Like it wasn't as robust in Utah when we went there to the parks there. And so I'm kind of like stuck in the middle of this, is that we already were not doing great on that front, and now we're just going to go backwards by trying to erase history that a lot of white people are uncomfortable with. Really.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it doesn't go to that extreme. I like in Glacier National Park, there's a really cool site there called Running Eagle Falls. Beautiful waterfalls. And they've got a story from the Blackfeet about that on there that was written by the Blackfeet. And then they also have that same story on a marker right next to it in Blackfeet.
Oh,
and
beautiful.
So, it's like, isn't that cool?
That's so
and
cool.
Because that's such a sacred site to them and them sharing their story. So, and then the work Shane's done in Yellowstone to make sure indigenous perspectives are told. And so having worked with different folks in different parks, I think everybody wants to do the right thing and make sure they're being accurate to tell the stories. But I actually, in some of my old presentations, I have pictures of historic signage, and I use them to talk about the bias. Well, look at the word, savage or primitive or warlike, some of the just, terms in some of those signs, and, to unpack that.
Yeah.
But we've seen some really cool examples of where folks have rewritten those to make them more inclusive now. But I still have some pictures of some of the older ones where it's like, it makes you shake your head. I can't believe they wrote that, but people were writing from the cultural perspective they had and with the knowledge base they had. And maybe in a lot of cases it wasn't any ill will. It's just, you write about what you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and your perspective.
Yeah, and history is written by the winners, essentially, or the dominant culture that feels that they've conquered the other cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we mentioned Little Bighorn, right? We've got curriculum for that that battle. And one of the lesson plans refers to an article from a newspaper in Bismarck, massacre. Well, this wasn't a massacre, it was a battle.
Mm.
Custer and his troops were attacking a peaceful village. And, it says no survivors. Well, there are thousands of survivors of that battle. The Lakota and Cheyenne survived, the assault by the Seventh Cavalry. And so, just things like that. The terminology, who's telling the story, and like there's going to be the 150th anniversary of that battle. And I know there's going to be riders there from different tribes and speakers and cultural presentations. And then how do we move on from that now, right? Say this happened, it was a significant part of our history, but here we are today. And I know, like, there's been members of the 7th Cavalry that have gone to the Lakota tribes and, apologized for the Wounded Knee Massacre and stuff. And so, I know.
That is pretty
And
cool.
so, isn't that cool, though?
It's really cool.
Yeah. But yet, this is another example of, there's movement to get the Congressional Medals of Honor. That was one of the largest awardings of those medals in the history of the military, was for massacre of women and children.
Oh my gosh.
And people wrote saying, please rescind those medals, or, put out a statement. But a lot of history textbooks will refer to that as the Battle of Wounded Knee. And it wasn't. But still today, we have, leaders at, the Department of Defense that still think of that as a battle, and that those soldiers deserve those medals of honor for killing women and children. It's wild. And so, some of that still, permeates, some of the history and people at the top levels of our government.
Yeah. Well, and also we're seeing that in Gaza as well. I think that there's so much, like, this still happens today in other countries. And, well, we're seeing it now also with in our political environment in the U.S. as well. But yeah, it's...
Yeah, if you don't know your past, we're doomed to repeat it.
And that's what we're seeing right now.
What kind of lessons can we learn with what happened from indigenous populations and apply them to today? I think that's why so much is so relevant, and how can we rethink things and treat everybody as a relative, no matter your political views and where you're from. And, we're all just humans. And, how can we treat everybody as that? Like in Dakota, we say, Kachewi Chasha, just common people. No one's better than anybody else. We all might have our own unique gifts and abilities and talents, but, when it comes in the eyes of the Creator, everybody's equal. If you have more money, whatever, when we all die and go on to wherever we go, we're all going to be judged based on our actions, not how much money we have or how many cars we drive or, how many houses we own. It's, how are you as a good relative? How did you help people? Like someday, all of us are going to be an ancestor, right? What are our descendants going to say about us? What did we do to, maintain languages, cultures, healthy environments, for future generations, down the road? So that's why I always tell people, you're making history now. And think long range about when you're going to be an ancestor and what are our descendants going to say about us. So
that's such a great thought. Well, and this is kind of also similar in like thinking about your actions and the way you're being a visitor to a lot of these places. This podcast and my work is a lot about national parks and public lands, and which are all indigenous lands. So what would you suggest to visitors visiting national parks or state parks or really any kind of public land and public park out there about how they can educate themselves about the tribes and the peoples whose homeland they're visiting and all of that?
Maybe a lot of states have cultural resources like we have at our office. A lot of state departments like Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota have put out resources for their tribal nations, and that's one place to start. Looking at what have the K-12 systems put together, but then a lot of those parks have their own interpretive programs, and I would be sure to check those out because like that's a work in progress too, and hopefully we're not going backwards like we were saying. But I guess just think about the landscape from an indigenous perspective. Try and imagine not all the cars driving by, the buildings, and just be there in that spot. and try and connect with the environment. Take your shoes off, feel the earth, and just be there, be in that moment, and, appreciate the landscape. I think that can be something we could all do. Just be quiet and just listen. And just listen to the birds, listen to the wind, feel the grass. That, I think, really can help people connect the place. But then from an indigenous perspective, all right, we've got songs for the land, we have songs for water, we've got songs for the clouds, songs for the sun, for the moon, for all these different animals, honoring songs, thank you songs, and so for indigenous peoples to have that spiritual component to the land and have certain ceremonies that are connected to it. And then there are also connections with the celestial knowledge and star knowledge and knowing when to move camps based on when certain, stars are in the sky. And, that's really cool too. And then all those oral traditions that are connected to these star stories are so fun too. And then, how some of these star stories are connected to plants here on the earth. And then there's songs that go with that. And so it's neat to, from my perspective, to be somewhere and see a plant on the ground. And it's like, oh, yeah, there's some bitterroot. Well, I know there's songs about bitterroot. I know the Salish have stories about bitterroot. And we've got stories about bitterroot and, what it's used for. And just, thank that plant for being here, and just say thank you. And, just acknowledge that. So that's kind of what I do when I'm out there in the landscape.
What's that? It gave me chills because I think that I think a lot of people go to the national parks and to parks and they revel in the beauty. And I'm guilty of this as well because I was not raised to have this really deep connection with the natural world around me. And so it's a stretch for me to kind of even take off my shoes and really appreciate and listen and pay attention to the small things, not just the grandeur that we see in these places. Yes, the mountains are incredible, but also, yeah, like you said, the small plant at your feet or the birds that you're hearing, it's all a system and we're all a part of that. And
yeah, that symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
And we're a big part of that. So how can we be a good relative to the earth and to each other?
I love it.
We'll leave you with that message. How's that?
That's perfect.
Well,
if there's anything else that you wanted to say too, let me know.
I'll leave you with this. One thing my dad told me when I was growing up, he said, Mike, you should never criticize someone until you've walked a mile in his moccasins. And I asked him why. And he said, well, that way it can be a mile away, plus you got his moccasins.
I love your dad. He's got a great sense of humor.
He's probably up there in heaven laughing at me right now. So.
I love it. Well, that is a perfect way to end it. And I really appreciate you, Mike. It has been such a pleasure talking to you. And thank you so much for being on the podcast.
You bet. Well, honored to be here, Elizabeth. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck with your work.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Charm of the Wilderness. I hope you felt inspired to appreciate the richness of our public lands and national parks and the vital role they play in the climate justice movement. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. You can also receive these episodes right in your inbox by subscribing to Charm of the Wilderness on Substack. Together, we can raise awareness and foster a deeper connection with nature and each other. Until next time, keep exploring the wild charm around you, and remember, every little action counts in the fight for our planet. Stay curious and connected.